Welcome back, everyone. As usual, if you have a webcam, if you can turn on your camera, could be appreciated. Let's review. Previous lecture, previous week, we start working with this idea of agility. Now, we want to deliver software quickly. Where we start? Step number one in the process. We want to be agile. We want to start programming. We want to start developing software. We need to understand what we are going to do. You have a homework in the Pac-Man video game. Step number one, you want to develop the Pac-Man quickly, agile. We need to talk about resources, how many people can be involved and so on. But the first thing is you need to understand what you're going to do. And my homework number one is asking you for the requirements or the understanding of what is the Pac-Man video game. Let me be clear. Number one, the first thing that we need to do here is the process that we're going to follow. We decide that we're going to follow this agile methodology, so an agile process. Whatever. It doesn't matter the process. We need to understand the steps. We agree that in agile or in the waterfall, step one, requirements, understanding what we are going to do. Why? Because think about this, big picture. You want to create a product. It doesn't matter the product. Step number one is take the product, take your customer, and understand the product. If you follow the agile, that understanding is going to be in your user stories. And I am assuming that you know what I am talking about with these user stories. I am sure that you remember the template as we're going to talk about it, but the classical template for user stories. If you follow a different approach, if you are in the waterfall, in the plan-based, probably you remember your diagrams, the use case diagrams. One thing that I want to be sure is we agree that the text inside of these ovals or the text here is a functional requirement that you want to implement. It doesn't matter if you're creating a diagram that is to put the things graphically and maybe explain to others, understand, or if you're creating these stories, these cards that we're going to talk about it. But these things here and this thing here are the features of the software, the functional requirements for the software. And it's exactly what I asked you to do for the Pac-Man video game. Functional and non-functional, what the Pac-Man video game do. Why we want this? Why is so important to put these things clear and correctly? These, your requirements, are the starting point to defining the task that you are going to do during the process. Let me be clear, the task, the activities that you or the other members of your team are going to do in order to accomplish the product. It's the first step to split the work as a team project. If you create these requirements in a way that they are not easy to split, they are not easy to understand, they are not small enough, they are not balanced, you're not going to use them to split the work. You're going to have one or two people doing more or less. And I want to review with you what you submit as your assignment one and maybe make my point for this plot. We need the requirements correct in order to start working in split the tasks. Now, here I have a question for you. Can you help me? What is a task? Obviously, in the context of software, right? What is
coding can be one task and testing can be one task.
Those are examples, yes. Definition, task. Is the smallest division of the requirement? let me put these concepts here because I am going to need them later. Number one, can you agree with me that a task is, okay, that is going to be the task. Number one, a task is a collection of steps. A task is something that you're going to ask one person to do in one sprint, 1 or 2 days, week, depending on your time. A task is something that you are going to do to accomplish one of the features in the system. When you have a requirement, what you do with the requirement is to split the requirement in 1 or more tasks. And then the tasks, the person, can be split in 1 or more steps. I need you to remember this. Steps together, a task. Several tasks together, a functionality, a functional requirement. That is what I am talking about here. Requirement, task, step. 3 different levels of abstraction. When you think about the work that one person is going to do, we're talking about task 1 or more, which means 1 requirement or maybe something that is connected with a requirement. But we're talking about several steps. And someone told me, well, you're going to do testing. Testing is your task. Okay. And that task has several steps. Maybe in order to do testing, you need to set up your testing environment, or you need to create some objects in order to test something that cannot be implemented. Pollo objects, whatever. All those details are the steps, details, task, your goal. And your goal should be 1 requirement or something that is in part a requirement. Make sense? 3 things: requirements, task, and steps. Why this is important? Well, this is important because I need to review what you share with me as a requirements. Now, something that I need to introduce here in order to have a framework for evaluation. Every single time that you create one of these, 1 requirement, I am talking about the requirements, not about the task involving that requirement, not about the steps. I am talking about the root of the tree. The root of the tree is 1 requirement, in particular, functional requirement. For each of the things that you define as a requirement, you need to ask yourselves if that requirement accomplishes the invest principle. Invest. Something that you're going to read in Agile is invest in good stories. And these invest are these letters. Every single time that you define a requirement, something that you think is a requirement, you need to ask if that sentence accomplishes the invest principle. What are you talking about? Number 1, if you have a sentence, you need to ask yourselves, you need to ask your team when you are defining that requirement. This requirement, this line that I define is independent. What is the meaning of independent? That if someone in the team decide to do that requirement, that someone do not need to work at the same time in the same computer with another person that select another requirement. If I choose to work in one of the requirements that you put in your list, that you submit, if I choose one randomly, if that one is a requirement, I should be able to work in that without a close connection, without being in the same computer, same place, or in close communication with someone else doing another thing. I should be able to work in that task because that one is independent from others. In some point, we will need integration, but let me be clear. One thing is integration, and another thing is working together always. We talk about drawing the Pac-Man and moving the Pac-Man. Hopefully you can agree that someone can work in drawing the Pac-Man in all the aesthetic things, and someone else can work in all the listeners and keyword things separate. And in some point, in 5 minutes, they can put together things, integration. That is integration. Two people working independent and then connecting. Different than having the two in the same computer, basically writing the two things together because they do not know how to split or because the tasks are not separated. If you have requirements and that requirements can be done by two different people working separate, your requirements are independent. Every single time that you define a requirement, ask yourselves, this is independent? These have loose coupling with others? If yes, that is a requirement. If not, that is not a requirement, not yet. Second, this thing is talking about what needs to be done, not about how it's going to be done. Requirements are for defining functionalities. Requirements are for you, software engineers, but also for the customer to understand. Never, never, never in a requirement, you talk about how you are going to solve the problem. You do not talk about technical stuff. You do not talk about recursion, loops, condition, classes, technical frameworks, nothing. That is not there. What is there is what the software is going to do, not how you are going to solve that particular functionality. If you review, if you read your requirements and this is true, a keyword that we put there is, okay, good, this requirement is negotiable. Negotiable means that you understand that and the customer also is going to understand that because it's not technical. That is the key idea, that we can negotiate because we both understand, not other things. Valuable is connected. Think about this. Everything that you read, every requirement should be something that is important for the customer, not for you. For instance, a common error, testing. Testing itself, testing alone, is usually not a requirement by itself. It's one step or one task for a particular requirement. For instance, if you think about, I need to move the Pac-Man. Moving the Pac-Man is the requirement. Usually, moving the Pac-Man is going to have two tasks. Number one, the implementation of the moving, the implementation of the listeners. Number two, the testing of that, right? Two tasks. But the requirement is moving the Pac-Man. What is valuable for the customer is that the Pac-Man move. That is your requirement. Tasks or things to do when you choose to implement that? Well, obviously, implementation, testing, and maybe design. You cannot put as a requirement testing that the Pac-Man can move, because that testing is not valuable for the customer. The value for the customer is that the Pac-Man move. That you test that, we are assuming that you're going to do that. It's a task, not a requirement, the testing. Estimation. These two are going to be connected. Every single time that you read a requirement, the question that you should ask yourselves as a software engineers is, how many times do I need to implement this? Let me be clear. The only reason because you should ask yourselves that is because if you understand the requirement, if you understand what you're reading, then for sure you can do an estimation. The first thing that you can notice is if you cannot estimate something, I have no idea how many times do I need to do this. What that is telling you is you do not understand what you are going to do. It's a red flag for you. If you think that the estimation is hard, maybe the problem is not the estimation. One problem could be your experience. That is a different path. We need to talk about it. But the first red flag is, do you understand the requirement? This is clear. If you cannot estimate, probably not. Connected with the idea of estimation is it should be small. Every single requirement, small. But here, be careful. We're talking about requirements to be small. Common mistake. because you're thinking about small requirements, people sometimes make the mistake to move too small and therefore listing tasks instead of requirements. Because I need to move to something small, instead of thinking about implementing, moving the Pacman, and that obviously includes the testing, people make the mistake, okay, this should be small, I am going to define implementing moving the Pacman and testing moving the Pacman as two requirements. They are not two requirements, they are two tasks, one requirement. So careful with the small, not too small that they are tasks. Finally, everything should be able to be tested. Think about this. Estimation is about, I am going to start and I need to think how many times I am going to need, or resources or whatever. Testing is about, okay, when I finish, what I need to do to be sure that what I did is what I was asked to do. What can I do to show my team that my part is done and is correct? That if after integration something failed, it was not my fault. It's a little bit selfish, the idea, but remember, you're doing the planning. It's better to be selfish here, not later with the complaints. So invest, independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and tested. If I ask you to apply this, if I ask you to review your own requirements, the ones that you submit for the Pacman video game with these principles, what do you think? Your requirement passed? You checked this before? My recommendation for your homework was to review 3 of these. I didn't give you the name, but I asked you for be careful with the size, another 3. I can share with you what I read and maybe ask for your help with the evaluation, ask for your help for feedback to the team that did some work. So your assignment number 1, I want to talk with you about assignment 1. Randomly, maybe I do not have time to review everything, but some of your homeworks. Disclaimer first, I need to be clear. You submit your homework, your assignment number 1, you are going to receive a grade for that. The things that the grader is reviewing in your assignment 1, basically, is that you submit something. I ask the grader to give you full points. You're going to receive maybe a 100. If you submit something that makes sense. If you submit something and your requirement is hello world, 0 or whatever. Your requirement is hello, I am the professor, 0. I mean, a file that have text is going to be a 0. But if you submit something that is talking about Pacman and some ideas there about what the Pacman should do, probably you're going to receive full points. Again, we are reviewing basically that you submit something. Why? Because my goal with the assignment 1 was basically to do a survey. I need to know your previous knowledge. So I ask you to do this homework. I am going to give you points for submit the homework, but I am not grading or asking the grader to grade your knowledge. Not yet. The next assignment is going to be about that. So why I am talking about this? Guys, it is clear that even though you have a 100 in one of the requirements that you submit in assignment 1, if you put the same requirement in your exam, if that requirement is wrong, and that is the reason because I am going to review them with you, in your exam, you're going to receive a 0. Professor, but what's the same requirement that I put in my assignment 1? Your assignment 1 was not reviewed, not graded. We review that here during the lecture. So I am going to give you several examples of mistakes. It's going to be your responsibility to check if that mistakes apply to whatever you submit. This is clear, and I need yes or no.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Good. So submission, good grade, but let's review the details. Scenario number 1. The numbers are requirements, right? Each of these are a group of requirements, and I need your help to check if these requirements are, number one, they are requirements or they are needs. Hopefully they are requirements, but if not, why not? They are requirements, or maybe they are tasks, or maybe they are steps. I do not know. Let's check. What do you think about reading the 5 and the 7? Obviously, this is the same document. So if you read the 5, I remove the 6 because it's not related. You read the 5 and then you read the 7. Can you notice something? Can you change? Will you suggest to change something? Okay, thank you. I agree with the chat. Looks like the same, if not very similar. 5 and 7 could be 1. Agree with me. Different ways to read it, different way to state, but this is the same. It's about moving the Pac-Man. And the second one have a little bit more information about the arrows, but it's the same. Rule number 1, when you're creating your requirements, you are a team. You are a team not only for the homework, but outside. There is no project in which only one person defines the requirements. The idea is that you do this as a team because, well, you need to notice this kind of stuff. Be careful to do not repeat yourselves. And I am sure that you know this term for coding, do not repeat yourself. But the same thing applies with the requirements. You're not creating a document that should be long, because longer the document, then harder the project and more time that I can ask for. You're showing a document that should show what you're going to do, because that is going to be the beginning of your planning. Well, do not repeat. Rule number 1, be careful with this. What do you think about number 8? And I give you a hint with the red boxes, right? What do you think about 8 as a requirement? I agree with the chat between the 5 and the 7. The 5 look like ambiguous. The 7 looks like more information. I will put those two together, or if I need to remove one, probably I will remove the 5 and keep the 7. Up to you, but I agree with that. A little bit ambiguous, the 5. 8. What do you think about the 8? I put a red box in the if, because when you have an if, you remember conditions. The big question that I have for you guys is, a condition is a requirement, a task, a step. Let me be clear with this and follow with the chat. You cannot have an if as a requirement. What I am telling you is 99% of the time. There are always exceptions for everything. But usually, if you read an if in a requirement, that if is not a requirement per se, but something that is a step or something that should be inside of another line or another thing that is a requirement. Is usually the if something that is telling you probably this line is not complete. Probably this is part of something else. In particular with the number 8. If the user do not provide an input, continue moving. This is a particular thing, a detail, but the requirement itself is move the Pac-Man. Your requirement is, I need to move the Pac-Man. Okay, in order to move the Pac-Man, probably I need to use the keyboard. Okay, but every time that you move the Pac-Man, you need to review for collisions. Or every time that you move the Pac-Man, that status, that direction that you select is going to continue to be there until a new status is enabled. If you remember state diagrams, if you remember these use cases, what we have is move the Pac-Man in the requirement. But then you have associated with that use case, with that oval, probably a state diagram that is going to show the different states, in this case, the directions, and maybe an activity diagram that is going to show you the details such as every time that you move, every time that you change the position, you need to check for a collision. That is details. Think about it. Why I am talking about details? How do you identify details? If this number 8 is a requirement, then you can ask one programmer to do this number 8. However, if I ask one programmer, you programmer, your work is going to be to check this, to do this. It's going to be possible for that programmer to do his work independently. The first thing that programmer is going to tell me is like, well, why not that guy that is doing the movement take care of this? Because this is one step there. It's part of the same idea. My comment, be careful with the ifs. The ifs usually suggest not a requirement itself, but something that is or should be inside together with the requirement, the real requirement, the whole. Makes sense? Here, my point, guys, is 8 should not be the requirement. What you should have is something that is a requirement, move the Pac-Man, and this requirement should have an explanation, details of what is the meaning of moving the Pac-Man. And this line, this condition, should be here inside of the details. When you think about the use cases scenarios, if you remember use cases, and something that I ask you is to read the Introduction to Software Engineering, watch my videos maybe, but when you're working with diagrams, you put here, move the Pac-Man, and each of these have one table, one document in which you explain what is the meaning of moving the Pac-Man. When you think about user stories, and something that we need to review careful, but usually you think about this story in one face of a card, and in the back of the same card, the details. The details of what is the meaning of whatever you have in the front. Here, moving the Pac-Man, the requirement. The back of the story or the use case details is going to include this 8. And it's going to include several other things, because you need to tell what is the meaning of moving the Pac-Man, all the details involved. Use case diagram versus activity diagram, if we're talking about UML. Front of the card versus the back of the card, if we're talking about user stories. Do not put these things alone. They cannot be alone, because alone they do not have a meaning. They are not connected with one functionality as a complete idea. So that is the problem with my number 8. It's important, the information should exist. It's not a complete requirement. It's more like a task, a step, something that is explaining the details of the real requirement. What about the number 9? You know what? The main thing is, what is the requirement here? Ask yourself, what is the functionality that number 9 is asking for? If you're thinking like, well, number 9 is asking for drawing the ghost, okay, but it's also asking for drawing the ghost house. So if you think that it's asking for drawing something, it's asking for drawing two things. So I could agree with you. It could be split. It's not small enough. Two things, the ghost and the ghost house. But review the writing. For someone, if I take this number 9 and I am part of your team, the main question that I could have is, what should I do? I mean, you are asking me to implement drawing something that is a ghost? Okay, you are asking me to do something that is the center of the maze, that is the ghost house. And here, be careful, because this is not independent. You're asking me for the ghost, and that is independent. But then, who should draw the ghost house? The same person maybe drawing the maze? This is just a particular element in the maze, right? Do we need to split this particular part of the maze outside of the maze? Do we need to do this kind of two things, the center of the maze versus the other parts of the maze? Probably yes, probably not. You decide. But the point here is, there are several different things here. That is not only one thing. It's not only one specific requirement or functionality to accomplish. This number 9 is talking about drawing one element that is going to be moving, one element in the maze. And for someone, it can be even like, well, you're asking me if I choose this number 9 to also do the movement of the ghost. So I am going to be responsible to implement some kind of way to move these guys. So I should do the 50% of the game, because basically the ghosts are 50%, Pac-Man is the other 50%. It's like, this is kind of unclear or maybe big. When you read something and you have 5 people in your team, if something is kind of unsure about if this is correct or not, if we all understand or not, probably that is calling you to refactoring the requirement, to be more specific, to change something. And that is what I feel with this number 9. At least split. At least one thing is draw the ghost. Another different thing is maybe draw the house. And question mark here, if I really need to separate the house from the maze. And a different thing is moving the ghost. They move in different ways. So they are going to be different requirements. Makes sense? Yeah. Moving forward. Good. Here, same scenario number 1. Someone mentioned non-functional requirements. They were optional for you. Non-functional requirements. What do you think about these 4 non-functional requirements? The first question is, they are requirements and they are non-functional. Do you remember the first thing that we're looking for in something that we call a requirement? A requirement should be unambiguous. And here, the thing that I put in red, and I think you agree with me in the chat, is the first big problem here is ambiguity. You can talk about ambiguity, is not clear, is subject to interpretation, and so on. But let me talk about the number 1. If you tell me high speed, what is high speed? In a requirement, you need to be clear, and clear means everyone understands the same. And probably high speed is a red light, because not all of us are going to understand. And think about this, it's not only technical people, but also your customer. What is high speed? My recommendation in general, in the requirements, do not use adjectives, use numbers. Do not tell me high speed, mention numbers. 5 seconds, 3 seconds, 1 second, millisecond, whatever, put numbers. Think about this. They are not going to pay you if you do not prove that this is true. And proving high speed is just like, even if you do this in 1 second, for me, high speed could be less than 1 second, and it's going to be an argument. Put numbers. This. Let me be clear. A responsive application that your program compile and run. That is not a requirement. Expecting that your program works is responsive. Used like that is something that is expected. Now, if you want to talk about reliability, if you want to talk about, well, this software is a server and this server is going to have only one failure in 1 year, that is a different story. But I do not think that that applies for the Pac-Man video game, right? If you want to talk about reliability, same idea that before, you need to talk about numbers. Okay, this Pac-Man is going to crash 1 time every, I don't know, put a number. Do not really apply, but my point is numbers. Responsive, any application should be this. Anyone. You don't need to mention this. My application is going to compile and is going to run. It's not a requirement. That is, should be in that way, period. Number 2. I think it's clear what I am going to mention here. We need numbers. What about this database? What do you think? Storing previous records in the database. Well, number 1, I am not sure if we have a database in the Pac-Man video game. We have a storage, but not sure if database per se. But assuming that we have a database and this is telling me store something in a database, best case scenario, that is functional, right? That should be storing something, recording something. Number 1, I agree with the chat. You do not need to mention how. You do not need to mention a database or whatever. But storing could be a requirement. But that is functional. So this is storing, functional. This database, technical stuff, you do not mention that. These two is 2 problems. The numbers and the other thing, be careful. Could be functional, but even if you move to functional, be careful to avoid technicalities. 3. Very careful. Testing, remember? We need to be able to test and verify things. Tell me, what are you going to do in order to review and to prove that this is for age 3 or more? This? Do you really need to do that? If so, what are you going to do to prove it? Probably not. Exactly. Not a software size requirement. I will go for that. Again, this is about ideas, but I could agree with the people in the chat. This is not exactly something that you, as the team that is developing the software, should care about it. I mean, remember, you're talking with your customer is giving you ideas, you convert those ideas to requirements, and you put those requirements in the software. if your customer tell you, I need a game for this age 3 or plus, you as the developers is like, well, tell me what to do. I mean, what I need to do in order to make sure that your game is 3 plus. If you give me specifics, I can work with the specifics, but do not ask me to figure out what does it mean this 3 plus or any other related requirement, right? Okay, you want me to use these particular colors? Good, I can use that particular colors. Okay, you want me to avoid this flashlight speed because that is against some particular group of people that could be susceptible? Okay, but you tell me. You are the responsible to defining the requirements. The only thing that I do is to implement them. So I will go with that. The 3 is not properly a requirement for the software. What about the 4? Ambiguity. What is proper? Yeah, I agree with that. Problem number 1. Problem number 2, the big one, implementation. This thing about documenting the software is not a requirement because it's not value for the customer. Remember, everything related with requirements, functional or not functional, is something that has value for the customer. And the customer is going to be running the executable file. The customer don't care about the comments in the code. It's not a non-functional. It's not a functional. It's something that is maybe a good practice in the team. It's something that you as a team do in order to continue improving your developing. It's something inside. It's not something that you mention as requirement. Because again, this is for all the stakeholders, you and your customer. This is a practice in your company. This is a practice in your team, not a requirement. And this includes documentation, coding standards, and everything related with infrastructure that you have. Now, we're going to talk about backlog, sprint backlog, items. And one of the items in the backlog, one of the things that you can do in a sprint is working in a requirement. But there can be another items, and those another items can include things that are important for you, but not for your customer. But we need to talk about that later. Right now, what I am talking about is functional and non-functional requirements, not about backlog items only. So requirements, this is not a requirement. This not go here. Good? Okay, we have more. Scenario number 2, different team, different perspective. What do you think about all of them? I put all of them together and I select some red boxes, but what do you think about all of them? Is 1, 6, 14, 24? Those are the numbers that are in the document. You read this, you're going to start working in this project. What do you think? Okay, reading your comments in the chat. I am sure that you agree with me that we are reading this and we are not sure what we're going to do. I mean, we're not sure if we're reading requirements, we're not sure if we're reading steps into requirement, task. Something can be improved. And that is my point right now, is you read this and as a team, it's like, well, we need to be sure about this thing. We have an area of opportunity here. The first thing that I want to mention, and point out is these are unclear, and even unclear, assuming that we all understand the Pac-Man video game. I was reading this, and the first thing that I noticed is, well, do we have a start point and end point in the Pac-Man video game? I mean, what is the meaning of that? My understanding, and I could be wrong, is, well, the Pac-Man starts at the center, so maybe the center is that starting point, not sure. But if that is the case, which is the end point? And I need more information here. I am not sure what I am being asked to do. Probably, as you mentioned in the chat, it's like, okay, this is the beginning of asking me to create the maze. If that is the case, your requirement is to create the maze. And for sure, create the maze is the requirement, and I need more information in the back of the user story. I need details like, okay, how those mazes are done, what should I need to do there? And if that is the case, probably this is a good example of something that should be as one step for creating the maze. It's like, okay, in the maze, if you consider that you are in a position A and you want to go to a position B, starting and end, it should be a path that connects to those two positions. I don't know. That could make sense for the one, a step, a detail of the real requirement, the thing that have value for the customer. Value for the customer is create the maze. And this is just one item in accomplish that task. The second one, I was not sure about this one. Put the player in a particular position is not connected with the maze, is connected with this initial status of the game, initialize the game. Something that several of you describe is, well, in some point, we need to put everything in place to start the game, to start playing. And start playing or initialize the game or whatever is the name that you use is, well, create the maze, scoring 0, the players are the center, and maybe show some particular label or message on the screen. Different people describe different things, but all those things are use the details of one particular need, that is, let's start playing. One step, one thing to do, the initialization of the status. For the Pac-Man, the Ghost need the same, initialize. In any moment, the Pac-Man changed the number of ghosts. We move the numbers. Okay, I mean, I am asking, but the speed change. Here, the big question is, be more specific. I mean, it's going to change twice or change in which level. When you create a requirement, remember, you are telling someone what to do. Provide specifics. Change the number. I think this is something that should not be there. I mean, basically, you have always the same number, and, well, the Pac-Man can eat some of them, and it's going to go back to the center. But you do not change the number, right? I think so. Unless a particular implementation exists that is different, but in the game in general, that do not happen. The last one, it is true? Exactly. That is a big point. Number one, this is one step maybe in checking collisions. Checking collisions. If these and these are in the same position, there is a collision, there is going to be a consequence. Now, that consequence depends of which are the elements, but also about other things like the status of the elements. If the Pac-Man, the user, is in the same coordinate as the ghost, you need to remember that is, well, two possibilities. One of them is going to be the winner, depending of, the status, the power pill. So put this in one line is not exactly true, because that is not something that happens every time. Moreover, the game is not going to end unless the meaning is ending that life, going back to the beginning, going back to the initialization. Not clear. Maybe a step. Not clear. This can be improved, right? Hopefully as a conversion. I am not giving the names, but these are yours. So if I am talking about your requirements, hopefully you have time to review them with your team and therefore work on them. Again, guys, you're going to receive maybe 100 for this. You're going to receive full points. This is not correct. You're receiving points for submit something, your effort, start working, but this is not correct. If you have specific questions about your 25, 26 or others, please ask me, ask the TAs. We can help you with your homework. But again, my point is these are not correct. Fix it, and maybe you can ask us for feedback in a new versions. Good? Okay, moving forward. Scenario 3. I mean, there are more submissions, so I have more to review here. What do you think about this scenario number 3? And I am showing you requirements 9 to 16. What do you think? Remember that we have ones that were like too big. And I mentioned this, well, be careful to do not move to the opposite. And probably here we're looking to examples of the opposite. Very, very big. Very, very small. Overlapping, repetitive. Okay. Hopefully you agree with me that the red boxes, the Pac-Man need to move horizontally. The Pac-Man need to move vertical. Well, the Pac-Man need to move with the right, left, up, down keys. I think you could agree with me that you can make all of this maybe one requirement. Hopefully you can agree with me that all this, I mean, at least 9, 10, 13 to 16 is talking basically about one requirement, and the requirement is the one that I mentioned before, move the Pac-Man. That is the real requirement. That is what I want as a user. That is what has value for me. I want to be able to have this game, and I want to be able to move the Pac-Man. The Pac-Man represents the user, right? I want to be able to move that yellow circle. That is the functionality. That is what I want. Moreover, that is what could be the requirement. The details, the specifics. Well, I want to move that guy with the keyboard. That is a specific. That is something in the back of the card. That is kind of details. And well, if I am going to use right, left, up, down, probably this horizontal vertical movement is obvious. Steps for one task. Move the Pac-Man. That is one task, one requirement, the moving of the main characters. Clear? So again, there are details here that should not be in a requirement. Again, a lot of this is use the steps to achieve the goal. Steps are not requirements. Requirements are connected with one or more tasks, not steps. So all of this probably is only one. But again, probably you're going to receive full points, but this is not correct. If you do something like this in the exam, it's not good. Moving forward, scenario number 4. What do you think about this scenario? Because now we reviewed 3, this is the 4. I think now you have experience. Now you know like what is happening here, what are the common problems, and maybe how to solve those problems. 1. Randomly, you are the developer that are going to do the requirement number 1. Do you know what to do? Draw the background. If you receive that and it's your task, I am sure that the first thing that you're going to ask is like, what I need to draw? What is the background? The background is just the color or a particular image, or are you talking about the maze? And if you're talking about the maze, what should I do in order to draw a maze? Hopefully you could agree with me. A lot of questions that are going to be with this number 1. You cannot just give the number 1 to someone and that someone expect to know where to start. Ambiguity, number 1, need to be fixed. Number 2, 3, and maybe 4. Can we do something with 1, 2, 3, 4, 6? Do you found some kind of relationship in 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 somehow? Yeah. I do not want to put a particular name. You're mentioning several in the chat, but is initialize the game, render the game, start the game. There is a requirement in which we need, as before, everything on the screen in order to be ready to start. And hopefully you notice that these 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 somehow are asking for specific elements that should be there. These are the steps to initialize the environment of the game. This is a requirement. The requirement is to create the view for the system. And the view have particular elements. And those elements are the ones that are being described here in these different lines. The lines are valuable. The lines are giving me information. The only thing is I need you to be sure, I need you to know that these lines are steps, not requirements per se. And therefore, these things are not going to become user stories. These things should be inside of the same user story, as the details of that user story. The functionality is 1, starting the game, initializing the game, rendering the game, put things together for starting the game. Because later you're going to have these functionalities of restart, stop, new game, whatever. And they are going to call this requirement. They are this, having those things on the screen, those details. So probably if one person write this, instead of 7 requirements, what I am reading here is, well, at least 5 of them is really 1 requirement. Did you notice this if here? Similar to the previous one. If you have an if, probably that line is part of another requirement. It's a detail of another requirement, not a requirement alone. And I think that you did this for the submission, but just to be clear, when you submit requirements, when you're working with your team, you do not need to put who create those. Even though a person A create these ones and a person B create these ones, you are a team. When you submit, it's going to be the same grade for A and B. What we assume is that all the requirements are the work of A plus B together. B review A review B. You are in the same boat. this is going to be a good or a bad grade for everyone, not only for separate people. So you don't need to tell me who create these things. Later with the code is going to be different because we're going to evaluate performance, but that is a different story. For the requirements, it's okay, you submit the requirements. We assume, unless other thing, that all the people in the team is working. Anyway, moving down. What do you think about these second paragraphs, in particular, the boxes in red? I am sure that by now you are detecting things that are details, steps, and therefore you can identify things, lines that, hey, this is not a requirement. I saw that error before. Okay, this is just a detail. The requirement should be a different thing. Qualification is like, how do you measure these things? You can measure the functionality, the full requirement. You do not evaluate the steps. You want to review everything. When something is hard to qualify, that is a second red flag that is telling you that this something maybe is not a requirement. It's something else, a task, a step, a problem, but not a requirement. Score increase. I am sure that you notice increase how? 1 point, 10 points. There is a question here, unclear. Using the keyword, a step in moving. Game over when they hit, not correct, because this depends on the status of the Pac-Man, right? Depending on one status thing, it's going to be game over or it's going to be points for me. 15 is not correct. Similar thing with the 6. Okay, makes sense. Moving forward. Scenario number 5. Now you are almost experts. Experts reviewing others, hopefully also reviewing your own team. What do you think about this requirement 34 in this document? Okay, there are several different things on the screen. Let's clarify. Number 1, the music, talking about audio, playing some audio. The audio in the game, without covering the details, is a functional requirement or a non-functional requirement? I am asking because I read something in the chat about it. Audio. We're going to move to the details, but if I want to express something about audio or visual effects, that is functional or non-functional? Okay, I have 50-50, now I have more functionals. Okay, let me be clear. When we talk about audio, it's a functional requirement. It's a functionality in the software. Reviewed this in my previous, in 360, but non-functional are constraints and qualities. Anything that is something related with the quality of the product, anything that is related with constraints in the product, constraints include which language to use to do the programming. Those things are non-functional. But anything that the software is going to do, anything that the software should include, any service that the software is going to provide, is functional. And playing some music is a functionality. It's something that the software is going to do, is a service that it's going to provide, is something there. Functionality, something functional, do not imply that something is going to move and therefore the music is not moving. So it's not in that direction. Functionalities is things that the software do. And if we want the software to have audio, that is something that the software is going to do, and therefore is a functional requirement. Music, functional. So in that level, we're fine. Audio functional, and then there are non-functional below. Clear, functional, the audio, visual effects, all those stuff is functional. Now, it is functional. What is the problem that I want to point out here with the 34? I want an audio when the main character is moving. I want an audio when the game is over. I want an audio when we start a new level. I want an audio when the pause. They are not independent. Let me talk about this. You have a requirement, move, right? Move Pac-Man. And that requirement implies several different steps. Particular steps, you are going to receive input from the keyboard. According with the input of the keyboard, you are going to translate that to a XY position. And according with that XY position, you are going to call, connect, link this move with the drawing of the character. But in the middle of these two, you are going to check for collisions. And depending on the collision, well, you are going to move or not. These are my steps. My requirement is moving. Could be the audio. One step in this moving could be playing the audio, playing a particular sound, not the background sound, but the sound, the specific one that I want to play when the character moves, or the specific sound that I want to play when a particular activity happens. Could that be one step in the requirement of moving? Can we identify that the main thing is moving, and playing the audio when moving in this particular scenario is just one thing that should happen and is part of this whole idea of moving? Can we apply the same logic for other things like collisions? I need to identify collision. Identifying collision is going to imply A, B, C, D. And if there are a collision, I want to play a sound. Can we identify all this, playing these audios as steps in several different tasks that maybe we already define, instead of having one task, and that task is to put audio in all the others? Why? Because independence. Because I want the movement to be a method, and I want the checking collision to be another method, and I want to be another method. And what I am going to have is people creating those methods. And inside of that methods, that people, that person, that developer can play the audio. Instead of having several different people doing those methods and ask someone else, another one, a third part, go review these methods, review all the methods, all these places where the action is happening, and modify those to include the audio. If you visualize audio with all these different bullets as one requirement, what you are visualizing is one people in your team is going to need to go read the source code that someone else create to do the different activities, and that person is the one that is going to modify all those method classes or whatever in order to add this new element of audio in those parts. To be honest, you do not want to do that. Why? Because you are asking this member of your team to go and understand basically the full project, because the person needs to understand where is the movement in order to put the instruction that is going to play the audio. Usually you do not do that. Usually you do the opposite. The person that is doing the movement, put this audio. The person that is going to check the collision, put this audio. For the people implementing the activities, moving, collision, add the audio is just one more step. Create one requirement with all these steps could not be the best way to work, thinking about independency. Again, when you read a requirement, think about one person doing that in the project. This suspicious. In particular, if you need to use bullets in a requirement like this, it's a red light. It's like, this is really a requirement, or maybe each of those bullets is a step that should be in another place. Bullets are suspicious in the same way that the if is suspicious. I am not telling you that is wrong. I am telling you those are the things that you need to check to be sure if something is correct or not. So audio as a one requirement, not. Audio as a step in the different requirements, yes. Different case, completely different, is the audio in the background. If you need audio in the background, that could be a requirement. Why? Because the audio in the background is not connected, is independent for everything that is happening. The audio in the background could be the same that put the score or create the maze or draw the Pac-Man. Is not connected. At the end, it's going to be the integration, a thread for the audio, a thread for the main, for the game. Two threads, two different methods, maybe two different classes. Audio in the background could be one requirement. But this audio that is connected with other activities is a step. Good? Okay, what about the non-functionals? Ambiguous, right? Numbers. Okay, now you know, you get the idea. Ambiguity. Scenario number 6. I didn't put boxes here. What do you think? Do you think that 11 is a requirement? What is 11 asking me to do? Exactly. Guys, when you create a requirement, highly recommended, not mandatory. We need to review the template for user stories. But usually, and this is something that you review with use cases, there should be a verb involved. There should be some kind of action or activity or something that should happen. Move, draw, etc. This statement is like, well, and looks like the introduction for something. It is not clear what. Probably I am understanding this like draw the maze, and that could make sense if we need to draw the maze. The maze is going to be in the full screen, etc. I am assuming that because I know the game in the same way that you know it. I can do an assumption and my assumption probably is correct, but it's because we know the game. You do not need, you cannot trust that the reader is going to do a good assumption. So be clear. This is probably not clear. 16. What do you think about 16? Is a requirement? Step. Is one step. It details. You're telling me that the initial value for a particular variable should be 3. Every single time that you read something and that something can be translated with one line in the source code, that you can figure out like, oh, var equal 3. That is a step. We're not going to review that, but usually when we talk about steps, we're talking about lines of code, statements, instructions, expressions, one or more instructions. When we talk about tasks, we're talking at least about one method or more, could be a class. And when we talk about the requirement, we're talking about something that is one or more classes, and those classes have one or more methods that have one or more lines. Requirement, task, step. This is a step. For sure, it's part of a requirement, but itself is not the requirement. It's just one specific in something else. Oh, the games should include lives, and there are 3 by default, and every time that the collision happens with the ghost and the Pac-Man, is one, remove 1 life to the Pac-Man. All that story together, the lives in the game, is the requirement. This is just one part of that story. Scenario 7, almost done. What do you think about this scenario 7, non-functional requirements? Yeah. Can you agree with me? These are functional requirements. All of them. You like the music. Here, guys, again, the reason because I did the exercise is to kind of put all together in the same level, and you can notice if you need to review something or not. I share with you my videos, 360 class. But one important thing that you need to review, if this is your case, is please be sure that you understand the difference between functional and non-functional requirements. These in particular are functional requirements, all of them. And I noticed this document mentioning this as non-functional. Why they are functional? Why we are sure that they are wrong as non-functional? Can you help me with that? Why these are functional? Exactly. Something that the software is going to do. Something. All the examples here, show, is something that the software is going to print or draw. Is something that the software do. Functional. Common error, because the score is not an activity in the game, because I am not moving the score or controlling the score or changing the score directly. Sometimes we think that they are not functions or activities. Well, remember, we're talking about functions or activities, the software, not the people. All these things that the software do, all these functional. And I am going to ask these examples in the exam. And again, if you receive a 100 for this, it's 100 for your submission. We evaluate that you accomplish the homework. But these are not non-functional requirements. They are functional. Review it. Okay. Next. Can you review your own requirements and fix them? I show you only 7 scenarios. I review 7 teams, and that is what I show you. Can you check yours? Can you check your own mistakes in preparation of the next activity? That could be my homework number 1. With your team, review your submission and check if you made any of the mistakes that I previously mentioned. Homework number 1. Homework number 2, something that you're going to have. is a quiz. Quiz 1 open 5:45. It's going to be open for 24 hours. So it's going to be open all day today, tomorrow. It's going to close 5:45 tomorrow. It's only 13 questions. More of the questions are about the syllabus and some questions about requirements. So you have the information that you need to answer the quiz. Quiz number 1. So quiz 1 is something that you need to submit today, tomorrow. And my assignment about review your submission. You do not need to resubmit. I am not asking for that yet. Just talk with your team, review if you make mistakes, any questions that you could have, let me know. Good? Questions, guys? The game must have the highest score on the device. Yeah, that one you are asking for, reading the chat, you are asking for a requirement. The requirement is store the scores, and a particular requirement there is show the highest score on the screen. So those are 2 things that you're asking: store the scores and showing the highest score on the screen, things that could be requirements. Good. The colors for the ghost are details. The requirement itself is to draw the ghost, and then if you remember the diagrams, in the diagrams you have draw the ghost, and probably for the diagrams you have 4 cases of inheritance, and in the inheritance is draw the ghost pinky, if we want to use that. Draw the ghost pinky, and for this pinky, that means a particular color with a particular algorithm from the movement, because remember, each ghost is not only the color what change, but how they move. So you can talk about the name of the particular ghost, or you can talk about, well, we need to draw the ghost A, we need to move the ghost A, and we need to draw the ghost B and move the ghost B, because they are different, really. It's not 4 instances of the same class. They are 4 different classes because they have 4 different methods in terms of how they work. So the color is used 1 step, but yeah, you need 4 different requirements. Good. The quizzes use the syllabus. Most of the questions are about the syllabus, and a small number of questions is about what is a requirement, what is a necessity, and so on. It's basically lecture 1 and lecture 2. Nothing about what we reviewed today. Lecture 1 and lecture 2 in the quiz. That's it. Regarding lecture 3, regarding today, the only thing that I am asking you is talk with your team, review what you submit, let me know if you have questions, and we will continue doing things like this in the next lecture. Good? Okay, guys. Thank you. See you next lecture.